The US and China have ended their latest round of trade negotiations in Shanghai with little sign of progress. The talks ended earlier than expected after US President Donald Trump accused Beijing of deliberately stalling the talks. US Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and top trade negotiator Robert Lighthizer met with Chinese Vice Premier Li He for the first time since negotiations broke down 3 months ago. The White House says China has confirmed its commitment to buy more American agricultural exports after Donald Trump accused Beijing of not following through on that promise. He also tweeted that China was waiting to see if Trump would win next year's presidential election before agreeing to any deal. But Beijing has blamed the US for the lack of progress.
The negotiations can only make progress when the United States shows full integrity and sincerity and conducts negotiations in the spirit of equality, mutual respect, mutual understanding and mutual accommodation.
Well, let's get more on the trade talks now with Jeffrey Tucker in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He's the editorial director at the American Institute for Economic Research. Welcome back to the program, Jeffrey. Now, these talks were overshadowed by Donald Trump's tweets, essentially undermining China's progress or involvement in these talks. Is there any point of these negotiations happening if all it takes is a tweet from Donald Trump to really derail the whole process?
Oscar, I don't know what to say. I hate to say I told you so, but I've been predicting this on the show now for many months. Donald Trump seems to be the only person in the world who does not want a deal. He thinks that these tariffs are great. He wants to implement more tariffs. He thinks they're essential. He thinks China's loss is the U.S. gain and vice versa. And this is the way he looks at the world. So yes, he set out and deliberately sabotaged these failed efforts at negotiations. And in fact, you almost get the sense that when the parties arrived there, they knew something like this was going to happen. And he sent tweets, and then he gave an interview on international television where he, condemned, China and predicted doom for these negotiations. He doesn't want a deal, and now he's already building in, a long time frame for when there's not going to be a deal.
Yes.
It's even worse than that. I mean, it's even worse. If you look at his statements about, that the second quarter GDP figures were actually really grim in the US. And if you break down the figures, a lot of the problem is the problems with trade with China, right? It's a Trump administration tariff policies that's dragging down US growth. He's in personal denial about this, and now he's blaming the Fed instead of his own policies.
Now, it wasn't long ago that Donald Trump seemed to be actually keen on inking a trade deal with China. He often tweeted that he was encouraged by the progress of these negotiations. So why has he changed his tune, do you think?
Well, so from the China point of view, the problem is the tariffs. That's the issue. From Trump's point of view, the answer is the tariffs. So he's glad for a deal so long as he can keep raising tariffs and expanding them, right? He still wants to put more tariffs on $300 billion of more products because he thinks that's the way to end the trade deficit. That's his goal. So you don't even have a clear basis for negotiating here. Trump wants preserved tariffs and even heightened tariffs. China wants an end to tariffs and a restoration of the status quo ante. So there's no chance for negotiations on these considerations. And all the rest of this stuff about intellectual property or how China's going to buy some more of our surplus soybeans and all the rest of it is all just kind of static. There's a fundamental theoretical problem here. The striking thing in the US, politically speaking, is that Donald Trump is really pretty much alone on this. US negotiators show up. American manufacturers want a deal. Everybody wants a deal. Oscar, it's a very strange situation that this is Trump's trade war. Alone, he's pushing this. And unfortunately, under the US law, he has that kind of personal prerogative to engage in a global trade war at the expense of two of the world's biggest economies. So it's really tragic.
Yes, and one of the accusations that he tweeted during these talks was that he believes Beijing is deliberately dragging its feet on these negotiations to see if Donald Trump will still be president after next year's election. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I don't think there's any truth to that. I mean, any objective observer has watched this thing for 2 years now and seen really not very good faith negotiations on the part of the U.S. It's actually really tragic. Here's what's striking. As you read the news, you read the statements from China, you see the kind of enterprising ethos that's emerging out of China. China has learned from U.S. tradition, pro-enterprise, pro-free trade, productivity as a result of ever fewer barriers to trade. All right, this is the model that China is pursuing today. At the very moment when China's become completely converted to this idea of open markets, the U.S. is turning against them. That's the reality on the ground, and it comes at great expense for everyone in the world, really, but in particular for Americans and people in China. It's very sad.
And there are signs also that perhaps Beijing isn't as keen or as desperate to reach a deal. Do you get the sense that perhaps Beijing might be waiting out to see if it can secure, I guess, more favourable conditions in any trade deal?
I don't think so. I think China is exasperated. All the negotiators on the Chinese side, they're exasperated. They're not even sure that if any deal they sign tomorrow is going to be valid the next day. This is what happened with the U.S. and Mexico. Whatever Trump says on Thursday may be reversed by Monday, depending on what he sees on Fox News. So, what you have in China is a loss of faith in the negotiation process itself. So China right now, all the trade diplomats in China are scrambling to develop new markets, and they're looking at a world in which these tariffs are permanent. So they're looking for other ways to grow their economy besides relying on U.S. markets. I think at this point, China is just showing up perfunctorily. Of course, China wants to restore the status quo ante, but so long as Donald Trump is president, that's not going to happen. Trump brags about this, but I'm telling you, it's harming U.S. growth, and he's depending on the Federal Reserve to bail out his own bad policies. And my only hope for here is that Donald Trump will somehow realize, based on the data and his advisors, that he's been wrong all along about the good effects of tariffs. But if you look at Trump very carefully and you understand his history, that is a very, very slim chance. I think he's, as far as I can tell, burrowing down in this theory that somehow Trump's tariffs are good for the United States, and there's not going to be backing off from it. So it seems to me that the world economy is trying to move on. China's developing its own trade routes. It's rerouting its own supply chains. Yes. China is not going to sacrifice its prosperity on the altar of Donald Trump's ego.
Okay, we'll see what happens at the next round of trade talks in September. Jeffrey Tucker, a pleasure as always.